Welcome to Inside the Industry, where I sit down with the people shaping the future of the life sciences to explore the moments that changed everything. From uncovering the decisions, challenges, successes, and lessons they learned along the way, to having authentic conversations that inspire, educate, and connect the life science community. Today's conversation sits at the intersection of science, business, communication, and something every innovative company eventually has to confront. Having great technology doesn't necessarily mean people will understand it, trust it, or buy it. My guest today knows that tension from both sides. Jason is the founder and CEO of Samba Scientific, a marketing agency focused specifically on the biotech and life science industry. But Jason didn't begin his career as a marketer. He trained as a biochemist working on cancer drug discovery and then made that leap from the laboratory into sales, product management, strategy, and marketing. Today, Jason applies a combination of scientific depth, his commercial acumen to help high growth companies build inbound marketing programs grounded in high value scientific content that educates and converts technical audiences. A committed advocate for diversity in STEM and accessibility science communication, Jason brings both scientific vision and genuine passion to every client engagement, making Samba Scientific a trusted partner for the life science company ready to scale. Today, we're going to talk about the why great science doesn't sell itself, what scientists often misunderstand about commercialization, how you build trust with an audience that is highly technical, and what happens to all of this as AI fundamentally changes how people find and consume information. Jason, welcome to Inside the Industry.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for making time for us today. So obviously, first question out of the gate is, you started your career at the bench, and here you are running a marketing firm. Not a normal transition for most people that go into bench science. Was there a specific moment when you realized, like, I don't actually want to spend my career doing research?
Yeah, I guess it was actually pretty early in my career. So I started actually doing plant research, working on transgenic Arabidopsis models.
Okay.
When I was in high school and college, I was really excited about agricultural biotechnology and the promises that could bring to the world in terms of food security, in terms of pest resistance, in terms of drought tolerance. And the experience, I guess, that I had of doing molecular biology, cloning, plating Arabidopsis seeds in the laboratory, it was hard for me at a pretty young age, but just talking to friends about it and telling them what I was doing, everybody thought it was just so cool. And I was really enthused, I guess, basically about like what the promise of the technology was while, sitting in a laboratory and conducting, biochemistry experiments was really just sort of difficult for me actually not talking as an extroverted person for extended periods of time. So it was fairly early on. I guess I knew it. It was a skill set that I had and it developed in college. And certainly was my first job, as you said, in doing drug discovery.
Sure.
But the promise of being able to basically be fluent in that knowledge area without actually having to do the work in the laboratory, to me just seemed like, something that would be maybe the best of both worlds.
No, absolutely. And when you thought about why it was that talking about science filled you more than the research, I mean, you mentioned the extrovert component, but talk to me a little bit about why that was where you were drawn to. Was there something fulfilling in those conversations that was unique to you and what you were looking to do with your career?
Yeah, there was a lot to it, I guess. Part of it is really sort of the vision and the promise of what innovative biotechnology could do. And I think part of it is education, because the vast majority of people, of friends, of acquaintances, don't know any biologists and don't know what they do actually. And so I think being able to sort of educate and communicate and quite frankly, even kind of get behind that promise and what that vision is was probably like the most exciting thing about those discussions then and now.
So true. I know when I started in recruitment, I started in healthcare, for like 12 years. And when I made the leap over to pharma, I was so concerned about my ability to communicate with individuals about the subject matter and finding that there is such a disconnect between very high level scientific individuals and the layman as to what we see maybe in an article or an ad or, why do they give 9 million adverse event happenings that are so minor in an ad? And why would I take that? That sounds horrible. But then when I really realized, and I'm sure this resonates, was during COVID and knowing what, the vaccine was based on my work here, it was like, here's an opportunity where I can communicate something effectively just almost through osmosis. So you're able to do that on a regular basis with people, which is incredibly empowering. Do you think that taking that leap from the bench into marketing and communication, was there areas where you struggled with fact absolutes at the bench and then transitioning that into meaningful storytelling? And how did you somewhat come to terms with that gray area in between?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess the short answer is no, not really.
Okay, great.
And and part of it, I think, is just the nature of bench research. And so the if you perform an experiment, for example, and say, you perform it in duplicate and triplicate, your error bars are too wide, the first thing that a researcher would do is redo the work, right? Redo the experiment, perform the experiment again, and see if they can tighten up the results. And so I'd say sort of like that sort of practice, I guess, when you move into sort of communications, I mean, really, when you're in sales and when you're talking to people, essentially, and there's different positioning statements that we could try on. If we're not seeing that sort of desired result and response, we can try to inquire and ask more questions
Sure.
around what is a more meaningful sort of positioning statement, right, for a given technology or a
Yeah.
given product. And so I think in both cases, there's certainly a trial and error sort
Mm.
of approach to it. I don't necessarily see it as ever departing from the truth as much as identifying, quite frankly, what it is that can tighten up our experiment or what it is that can tighten up our positioning for a given audience.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it and very profound to make that connection between the two and take out that area that I was thinking would be such a struggle from when I interview scientists or I interview engineers or anybody that's highly technical. It can be a stop if there is something, say, on a job description, we'll say, where it says you need 5 years experience and they have 4 years and 8 months. And they're very literal in what they do, which, is so important when you're saving lives or coming up with a drug to give somebody quality of life. But then how does that translate? But my guess is one of your driving forces in moving into that wasn't in your DNA, will say that everything had to be absolute. You were looking for ways to make things work, just like in marketing.
I think that's true. Always trying to make things work. One of the things that I experienced really early on was that I was at the bench and I was trying to break into sales, and I was interviewing with zero sales experience and not getting any job offers. And finally, networking, essentially, I got this first sales job and I was issued a new phone, a company phone. And on my first day of work on my brand new company phone was a voicemail from a recruiter asking me if I'd like to interview for another sales position,
How
essentially. So
funny.
I realized basically, on day one, that when you can check a box in terms of experience, right? Not just me, but quite frankly, the world
Yes.
is willing to look at you sort of differently, right? As a result of having, made that claim and substantiated it.
I hope that everyone listening really hears what you just said because I so often am in a situation where I'm telling someone, whatever that first job is, take it. It doesn't matter if the comp's there. It doesn't matter if it's the perfect job. Take it because you're more employable in a space when you have experience, right or wrong. Whatever, like you said, you had 5 minutes of experience and someone was already looking to recruit you. And I think that, especially now with the current generation coming into the workforce, people are truly looking for that perfect fit, maybe, or a certain number that someone said. And really, back from a Gen X perspective, I didn't even ask what I was getting paid in my first job. I was just, just get me into a job, right? And,
Right.
that, like you said, it really does prove that once you prove something, you're able to duplicate that and move forward. One of the things that I talked about with Patrick from Trio in my last episode was about the science and how many scientific individuals that are founders or even in a company are are in that camp that, the science is good, so we'll be fine. We'll be able to raise capital. We'll be able to go to market. We'll be able to make people aware of a product that's launching and all of the things behind that you support within a company. Obviously, that belief is not true. It's not always if the science is good. If it was, I think we have cured most diseases at this point, and we've got products on the shelves in so many locations that will never see the light of day for
Mm.
one reason or another. How do you deal with that objective? Maybe if you're calling on somebody or somebody says, well, the science is there, it'll sell itself. What is your answer
Yeah.
to that kind of situation?
Does it satisfy a customer need, right? And a
Mm,
meaningful amount of those customers, quite frankly, be the first question that I ask. I think part of the entrepreneurial journey that a lot of startup founders get right is actually finding the customer first and identifying a problem and then developing a technology around that problem or around that market. I think one thing that's probably harder for founders that are coming out of academia, where they've
mm,
been, say, grant funded, right? First research grants essentially, and then some startup grants, is that they really focus on the technology itself without necessarily quantifying that market and whether or not it's a good business idea ultimately to go after the market the way that they're going. So I think it really just depends on knowing the customer and understanding who's
yeah,
going to use this product and what are they going to use it for and why is this a better solution than anything else that currently is out there.
that makes so much sense. I think, yeah, again, going back to kind of that difference in mindset, one of the things that I always find interesting in January when I go to JP Morgan is listening to the VC individuals, what they're willing to write checks for.
Hmm.
And a lot of times it doesn't align with what scientists are working on that they're so passionate about or think that it'll sell itself, right?
Right.
We have saturated markets in many drugs and viability of a product that is 5% better than an existing product isn't compelling in a marketing statement unless that 5% is life changing. So bringing that back to the patient or the customer, so to speak, you really do have to know what they're looking for or what will resonate in order to understand where the research dollars should be spent because you can't recoup them if no one's buying the product.
Right.
And I don't think a lot of people in the world, from a consumer standpoint, truly understand the dollar value that goes into one product, making it through to commercialization. Scientists are trained, obviously, to qualify claims, embrace nuances, avoid simplification. Marketers are rewarded for clarity and memorability. There has to be a point where people are nervous from a scientific perspective that marketers will distort what the drug is or what they try to achieve, or maybe liken it to somebody that wrote a book and then it goes to a screenplay and it's not exactly what they had intended when it goes up on the screen. How do you make sure that there's a unification there or that the storytelling aligns with the client?
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes back again to who are we talking to and what do they care
Mm,
about, right? From a customer perspective. And so, really the idea of sort of segmentation, of segmenting your customers, of targeting which one of those we're going to speak to and creating these sort of positioning statements that really speak to their needs is important, quite frankly, in every aspect of life, right? Like self-awareness at a party, right? Hi, my
yeah.
name is what am I going to share versus overshare, right? What questions am I going to ask if I want to engage somebody, if I want to know something specific about them? So I think it's important to make a distinction probably between research products and clinical products with regards to
Mm,
marketing claims. in both of them, quite frankly, we deal in data, right?
Yeah.
And the claims that we make need to be backed in data. And scientists are skeptics, right?
Mm,
Like they've been taught and trained their entire life to question it, right? To seek validation, right? Of these claims, to repeat the experiment, right? To perform replicates for consistency and ultimately to determine what the truth is, right?
yeah.
And so I think it's really important that we tie data into our marketing when we're targeting scientific audiences,
Sure.
and that data, quite frankly, supports the claims that we're making, and that those claims that we're making are important to that audience to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's great. And, it's always interesting how unique our industry in marketing is from the data claim, right? And how you can go into a grocery store and something has that it's a protein pasta on it because it has 2 grams of protein, and no one has to qualify that in any meaningful way. Where what you do is very regulated from a marketing standpoint. And that definitely adds another dynamic. When you meet with these individuals that are hiring you, whether it's, a founder or a group of people within a biotech or pharmaceutical company or at some other life science group, and they are thinking that they have a marketing issue, how do you go about determining, or how do they go about accepting that maybe it's not a marketing issue and maybe it's a product or business problem, and how to approach that as they work with you?
Yeah. A lot of times we start by digging into what we call the sales funnel or the marketing funnel,
Mm,
and just talk about the customers that they do have. Like, do they have any customers, for example? If so, where did they find them? How are they using the product? Are they returning and buying it again? I think are pretty important. A lack of follow-up sales or continued product use is typically indicative of a poor customer experience, which could simply start up by the expectations of something, exceeding their real life experience of it, right?
right.
Or it could be in the use of the instrument or the data that comes out of it. So the first thing that we really want to dig into is customers. I guess this is now a recurring theme in my in my answers here. It all basically starts and ends with the customer
Customer, sure.
and ultimately what their experience is. So for example, if there's a few existing customers and they've been using the product for a long time and they're generating data and they're publishing, we just need more of them. That to me
Mm,
feels like a marketing problem. We need to identify who these people are and where they get their news and what they care about. And then quite frankly, start speaking and creating campaigns and messaging sort of around that so that other people like them will take note. And again, if they're, able to sell the product, for example, but have poor follow on, I would say it's absolutely say a product problem. If people are interested and have these initial conversations and ultimately they never buy it, right? I mean, that could either be say a sales problem.
sure.
It could also be a product problem, with regards to sort of performance, or even a support problem with regards to that sort of pre-sale support and that customer experience, from awareness, through making that purchasing decision.
That support aspect is, it in the day of a digital world,
Hmm.
support of the customer and their experience is, I mean, it was always important. The difference I think now is if it's not done right, everyone knows about it. And you just never know who's going to do what from a review standpoint. For us, for example, that would be Glassdoor for our clients. And I never thought that I would spend time coaching clients on how to respond and reputation management, because that there wasn't a lot of weight in that for a long time. Or
Hmm.
if the experience someone had with a product, it was like, oh, well, only the negative people post, or only, we don't pay attention to those. Those people aren't who, we have plenty of people that we work with that are good, but they're not expressing that. And you can't do the spray and pray marketing. Like you said, it's very intentional on those
Hmm.
customers that are using the equipment and how that is happening and what that experience is from early all the way through to use, that, you really have to dive in and figure that out. And that makes a lot of sense. With the trust in science and the claim substantiation. I mean, you talked about, the papers and getting people more engaged in that aspect, and the volume of that information helps. But how much of the marketing aspect do you think is building trust over maybe just awareness?
Yeah. Well, I think it's the second step, quite frankly.
Okay.
And so I really think, others have said, and I would agree, that after you create this awareness and people know what you have, right? In order for them to take the next step, you really have to inspire them with what your technology could do.
Mm,
The best way to do that really is by focusing on applications, these killer apps that are out there that people are actively, problems that they're actively trying to solve, something that everybody wants to do, but nobody can do it well right now, right? And that, quite frankly, is sort of the cutting edge of, I'd say, highly funded research, both in academia as well as in industry, right? Drug development, device development, disease-based research, really understanding how to utilize new technologies to solve old problems. So if they're inspired, then they are going to care enough to actually start looking at that data. And then that data, like I said, needs to back up what those claims are and show how you could do it, show that you can do it, show that they have done it,
yeah.
and really reassure them, right? Based on testimonials, based on data, based on publications and posters and talks, reassure people essentially that they can get it. And that's what really builds up that trust. And that's critical, I think, to capturing these new customers and to bridging that gap between, what marketing says and what the product actually does.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, one of the things I think that any service runs into is that maybe adoption of process, or
Hmm.
what comes first, right? Or, for example, a biotech CEO with limited runway says to you, Jason, I don't need brand awareness, I need revenue. How do you handle that type of question to resonate with that person in the situation that they're in now? Because we all know the pressure of the revenue generation when the funding is low.
Right. The yeah, the real question I guess that I have there, so it's is really around, do they know who their customers are? Do they know where to find their customers? Do they know what messaging resonates with their customers? Because the truth is that if you know those things, if you know what your customers look like and where to find them, and essentially what's going to pique their interest, and you have essentially the ability to, create that interest and then reassure them again, like I'm describing,
Sure.
that could absolutely be executed from a sales perspective. And I think it's worth maybe clarifying just real quick, like when I'm talking about marketing versus sales, I'm talking about sales as people talking to people and interacting
Hmm.
with people, right? And when I'm talking about marketing, I'm talking about people interacting with things and stuff, right? So seeing advertisements, being on their computer, things on a screen, right? The articles that you read, all of these things, right? That are
Right.
not people. So if the answer to all that is yes, if they know who their customers are and they know where to find them, and they have a deck and people are interested, then quite frankly, it might be a better investment for them to go hire more salespeople and scale that up,
Mm,
um, and just jump right in. If the answer to those things is no, right? They don't know who their customers are. They're not sure where to find them. They need more just like that, and they can't find them anywhere, right?
yeah.
Then, quite frankly, they're going to have to do the work, right? To get the message out there, to create that awareness, to get people in that marketing funnel such that they are interested in talking to salespeople, right? And I think that's a pretty critical first step. And maybe another follow-up question: if your sales reps can't get meetings, then perhaps marketing would be a good thing for you to invest in, right? In terms of
Right.
raising that awareness first.
Right. Yeah. If that opens the door for the salesperson that you're already paying, you're somewhat not doing brand awareness, but you're actually supporting the revenue generation through brand awareness. And
Absolutely.
yeah, that is so important. And like you said, that distinction between sales and marketing, I have that conversation often with early stage organizations that kind of want to put that all in one bucket. And it's a very different skill set. And, there are people later in their career, high level, maybe that are able to oversee both, but to do both is unique. And, if you're early, you want those hunters that are more apt to go after hardcore those sales versus the long game, which, I've learned over the years here. We didn't do any marketing even 5 or 6 years ago, and we didn't have to. It was, you had a phone book and a phone, and you picked up the phone and you called people and you made them aware during those calls, where that's not the world we live in now. And warming those interactions through marketing or brand awareness really does open doors for people. And that service you provide, obviously everything has a value, but it is invaluable to look at something where I see a name everywhere I go because of what your company has done. So I'm naturally more apt to purchase. And a lot of, the things that we're talking about, we're not talking about picking up a pair of sunglasses. These are heavy decisions, and brand recognition does weigh into that, whether people think it does or not. It's definitely a deciding factor. When you see companies at different stages of growth, you've brought it back to the customer quite a bit. So I'd like to explore that a little bit more. It sounds to me as though many people are unaware of maybe what their ICP or their ideal candidate or client profile is. I have that conversation often with my team is let's dial in, right? Let's not just pick up the phone. Why are you calling this particular company? When you're looking at an organization, why are you choosing that for, say, your hot list or something like that? Do you find that activity of kind of identifying that is something that is almost always missing just due to the fact that, maybe the scientific people aren't thinking from that perspective?
I, I, not necessarily.
Okay, great.
So, yeah. So at least with the companies that I work with, the vast majority are funded, I'd say, seed stage, A stage, some of them are pretty early stage, but I feel like they all have at least a general idea of who wants this, even if it could be a sliver, for example, of the total world, right? That could want this, right? So there's absolutely, I'd say, an exercise, and quite frankly, I think this goes more to sort of product management and product development, around sort of customer product fit. And so doing some discovery to identify, who would benefit greatest, say, from this technology, having just informational interviews with people that you think would be a good fit for this sort of technology, and understanding basically what they're doing, and what their bottlenecks and what their problems are. Soft pitching, essentially what your product could do, like, what if I could solve this problem? You know what I mean? Would that be meaningful to you, for example, in order to really identify what it is that they care about? So I guess my answer here is a little two pronged. On one hand, I think a lot of people they know somebody that wants it, right?
Right.
Or one particular segment that wants it. On the other hand, I think, especially with regards to feature development and with regards to generating, say, applications data or identifying new applications,
Mm.
that sort of customer discovery and those type of informational interviews are hugely powerful, I think, in sort of refining both, what the product is as well as how you talk about it to them.
Yeah, and I would think, to piggyback off of that also, what would be the value that you would associate with fixing that problem? Bringing it back to kind of what we do, there are
Yeah.
times where someone is willing, obviously, we wouldn't be in business to pay to hire people, but there are
Yeah.
certain roles that, what the price tag is for that isn't worthwhile. They'll wait and see if somebody applies or if somebody gets referred. So same with something scientific, unless it's completely new,
Hmm.
if it's something that is maybe like you said, an innovation to something and making it better through technology,
Hmm.
what would you be willing to pay, or what cost savings would there be? And really dialing that in with a client so that they know, it would be great if this solved that problem, but what you're going to need to charge for it, no one's going to pay that, or whatever the dynamic there is. So yeah, it definitely has a lot of layers for you to uncover throughout that early stage investigation with the client to figure out what the problem is. With, you've mentioned the applications a few times, and how that impacts, the marketing and the messaging. With AI now getting involved, are you seeing people think that, well, AI can do that for us? They can just put some messaging out and tell them what the application is going to do, or we don't need to pay a marketing firm, to do this for us. We'll just have AI do everything. My ChatGPT can write everything for me. What impact has that had, and what are those conversations like?
Yeah. So I think AI, so software generally, right, can increase productivity, right? Always has, right? New software essentially, right? That you would buy enterprise grade software, for example, that we use, as a marketing agency, is specifically designed for, say, designers, right? Or for project managers, right? For accountants, for time tracking, et cetera. And so each one of those things has a place and would be better than say using an analog thing. And that's why we use it. The reason I wanted to say that is because AI has really exploded, right? Like in the
Sure.
last 6-7 months, to the point now where we're seeing backlash against it, I think from marketers and quite
Hmm.
frankly, from sort of the general public. The ability to create things really fast needs to be differentiated from the ability to create things really good. Right.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge now for marketing agencies is to continue to provide value in the form of human creativity and intelligence and uniqueness. Because one thing that AI is not is unique,
Sure.
right? It is excellent at scrambling everybody else's words and ideas, picking up
Yeah.
and parodying at something that it saw and repackaging it for this context, right? But when it comes for sort of novel out of the box thinking, when it comes again for finding sort of what these insights are, and a way to relate that to people, I think it's really not good. And so, all that being said, in the hands of adept and thoughtful users and marketers, I think these AI tools have potential to drastically increase output.
Sure.
I think the pushback now is as recently as yesterday, right? The cloud announcement, the AI generated content is going to be watermarked. Following up with that, we use a program Built With that looks at what websites are built on. And it has recently started reporting AI generated content.
Wow.
In the world of AEO and SEO, you actually get dinged if you're using AI generated content
Yes.
instead of unique content.
Hmm.
And so it's sort of funny that despite all these advances in technology, everybody is realizing that it is not original thought, and it certainly doesn't have the value of original thought, right? So, so if you, in the old days, if you wanted to save money, right, writing marketing copy, you could hire a kid, you could hire somebody nearshore or
Yeah.
offshore, right? And by a kid, I mean, a young professional.
Right. Does.
You yeah, right. Yeah, we're going to have the intern do that, right?
Right.
Or somebody basically with just a lower cost basis, like I said, either at home or abroad. The advent of this type of generative AI technology, can certainly reduce the cost much further. But whether or not your intern is writing good copy, whether or not your writer in India is writing good copy, whether or not your AI is writing good copy, has everything to do with basically the directions that they're given and the review that's applied to that, right? And how closely that aligns with what your intent is, I'd say from a strategic perspective. So certainly
Right.
a lot there.
Yeah, there is. There's so much there. But you know what? You said something that no one has said to me. I have a lot of conversations around AI. And I went
Hmm.
to a biotech conference recently that was completely focused on AI. And
Yeah.
I we talk a lot about, human in the loop, or the person checking it and all of that. But no one has ever said that the uniqueness of thought is where we still are superior. And not just that a human needs to review it, but AI is pulling from data sources, where we are pulling from not only data sources, but experiences and our own imagination and creativity as human beings to try something new that's not documented and not out there for AI to pull from.
Right.
And that is that warms my heart that is still a thought process, right? And you're right, my SEO guy is very careful about anything that our younger group does for blog content or anything like that is mainly written through AI. And it is quick, and it does alleviate problems in bandwidth, but it can create other problems, like you're saying, in getting dinged for it or lack of quality content or originality for sure.
Yep.
And I think
Yeah.
marketing is a great place to explore that for sure.
Right. If you think about people's aversion to sales, people,
Hmm.
okay, the thing that always gets brought up first is the used car salesman, right? Right. It's a derogatory term, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Culturally, it's not their fault. You know what I mean? Whether the
No.
car works or doesn't, right? It's certified, whatever. And ultimately what people are or don't like about it is they're going to tell you whatever you want to hear, right? To basically close this deal and kind of get you out the door. And I think AI, quite frankly, is that used car salesman, right? It's going to tell you whatever, it's going to tell you whatever you want to hear, whatever you
Yeah.
ask for, right? It's going to give it to you. You know, it seems like the hallucinations are largely gone at this point
Yes.
from a generative perspective. But in terms of, especially I'd say in the terms of generating sort of novel content, right? It's really just going to, like I said, mimic and parrot and repackage everybody else's ideas, right? Without that sort of authentic, humanity, creativity, problem solving, sort of thoughtfulness that
Sure.
people want and people are looking for, right? So
That's
it
funny,
is,
that analogy. I use that analogy a lot in our business
yeah,
because, we are salespeople and people
sure.
think the word headhunter is dirty. But
Hmm.
yeah, I say that a lot. Like our firm is not used car salesmen. We're here to partner with it, and provide real value. But
Right.
something you just said about chat or any AI is so true. I was doing something recently, putting some documents together, and I asked it to prove something. And it came back with, Kimberly, I think this is the most profound thing that will ever come from scientific search. It wasn't, it was gassing me up hardcore. And,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think this is so great. And I think we should look at making this into, a 20-page blah, blah. And you're right. It's just trying to sell me on to continue to interact with it and use it. And I'm like, okay, quiet down. We're just proofing a document. We're not doing anything that crazy. So
Right.
yeah, and I was like, why is it doing that? But you're right. It wants us to engage. It wants us to continue to use it.
Yeah.
And especially when you have a paid account that is generating revenue. So it does become that used car salesman, anything to keep the deal going. With companies and scientists increasingly asking ChatGPT or AI, what happens when you're discussing something with someone and they got a different answer
Hmm.
or a different outcome when exploring it through AI? How do you work through that conversation with individuals that are maybe hardcore in the AI camp and think that it is, infallible?
Right. I think that's going to be really difficult. And I think that's an excellent question, right? A couple maybe anecdotes that are sort of funny. The first was a year or two ago, I was driving with my girlfriend in California on a remote stretch of highway, the Lost Coast or the Northern Coast. And it was flooded. The roads were flooded and some of the roads were closed and there were detours around sort of the closed roads. And she was using Apple Maps and I was using Google Maps. And both of us were trying to get to the same place that was only 10 minutes away on a direct road, but was detouring us to the left and to the right and around. And then trying to reconcile that with the road closure signs and the actual water on the road, right? And as it's getting darker and it's getting sort of spookier, right?
Sure.
Like the tension increases, right? And ultimately I did the reckless thing and I followed a pickup truck around the road closed sign, through 6 inches of water, 4 inches of water, something like that, right? We drove through it for 5 minutes. We got to our place in 10 minutes. That was after 2 hours of circling around and arguing about which app is right. And so I think we as people are going to have an issue reconciling this because I don't know how Google Maps works and she doesn't know how Apple Maps works,
Hmm.
right? And both of us are trusting inherently in technology that is not
Yes.
necessarily lining up with the truth that we're seeing. In this case, the water actually on the road and whether or not we could pass, in a safe way. So, so take that a step further. Yesterday, I saw a post. A previous colleague had asked essentially 4 different search engines, how many words are in this 4 different, AI engines, how many words are in this PDF, right? and got 4 different answers, even like on a basic word count, right? And so, I think an interesting sort of takeaway from there is we're as trusting in these AI models, even in their early stages, as we are in something like Google Maps, right? That's been around now for a decade,
Yeah.
right? Without questioning it, without being able to verify it, right?
Mm.
Necessarily. And quite frankly, like me even trusting her that that post was accurate and that she ran that experiment and those are
Yeah,
the real
right.
results, right? So there certainly is, I think, everybody's really busy. Everybody's looking for the right answer. The benefit of using calculators to do math and writing down your work is that you can come up to the same answer and you can show people how you did the work and how the number essentially of, say, a math problem was sort of the same and consistent, if you do it this way. Um, and it's going to be very, very different with AI, even if people are using, say, the same model, right?
Right.
Even if you're a Claude devotee, the model matters, right? Which model you're
Yeah.
using to do the work is going to
Mm-hmm.
change basically what the output is going to be. So I think, we professionally, culturally are going to have to be in sort of a, trust but verify sort of mindset
Yes.
with regards to the first answer that pops up. And quite frankly, if 2 people are using 2 different models and getting 2 different answers and who's right, I mean, you're going to really
Yeah.
have to go think about it, like
Yeah.
critically and discuss it as people and try to figure out what makes the most sense and why we would trust one of those over another.
A lot of people worry that over time there won't be people that have had experience doing that critical thinking. If they've only relied on technology and, it can be a little terrifying for sure. I mean, any change is, but what is there going to be a lack of applied knowledge versus what I refer to sometimes as people can go down a checklist, but can they take information and apply it to the next experience and grow and develop from that? But, people can get very uncomfortable and use that discomfort to their advantage. And other people get very uncomfortable and kind of withdraw from those experiences because of the discomfort. With AI and scientific communication, if there's misinformation generated by AI or perfectly accurate information that nobody can distinguish from anybody else's, what does one experience, maybe 5 experiences like that, do to the consumer's trust in science in general? And how impactful will that be, do you think, as time goes on?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So, false claims
Mm,
certainly erode trust,
yeah.
regardless of whether or not they're on purpose or accidental, right?
Mm,
The, in clinical products, you mentioned adverse reactions,
mm,
whether or not they're documented or undocumented, and sort of what the follow up on that, right? And what the transparency is on that can either build or erode trust around that sort of thing. So the I think, I think there might be there's sort of a bigger issue here, which is general, just sort of transparency of data analysis or transparency of data
mm,
presentation at all, right? Because I don't know whether or not data was generated with AI, if it's being
right.
presented, or whether the analysis was done sort of manually. And the truth is, the vast majority of data analysis is done on a computer, like all of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like people are
You know,
sitting there. Yeah.
for years, for decades,
Right.
right? With regards to sort of what that data analysis is. I guess I'm not sure whether or not it's going to create a crisis, whether or not we know something was AI, sort of analyzed, whether or not there was an error in the data analysis. I think it's incredibly important to continue to practice diligence, right? To double check your work, to repeat the
Absolutely.
experiment, to verify each step. And for those that are using AI, I think, there's multiple in the biological sciences, clients of ours and others that are using sort of, AI engines, but really documenting the steps, and providing that sort of transparency. So it's not a black box, so that people can go in basically and troubleshoot it and verify the steps that were
Yeah.
taken in analysis so that they can have trust then in the output. And I think that'll continue to be really important going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, I completely agree there. And with one last question in mind, when you look back on your career and the changes and the path that you took, what do you hope you help scientists become better at doing in the end? What is your hope that you leave kind of behind? with your career?
Yeah, I hope that scientists can become better at doing whatever they want, I
Mm,
guess is what it comes down to in terms of self-fulfillment, in terms of professional growth and career growth. I employ a team of scientists, ex-scientists, recovering research scientists, people that love science and wouldn't work in any other field, right? And have sort of found, that they too are more interested in communication, than they are in actually doing bench work. And so I'd say, through Samba, with the interns that we've had and the career growth that they've had, with colleagues, with people essentially that I can support, and help them sort of get to whatever their next level is, I ultimately feel like that's going to be my lasting, hopefully professional and personal legacy in terms of what they've been able to achieve and how I was able to help them get there.
I love that. I love the recovering bench scientist or recovering research scientist statement, and showing people there's a lot of ways to live and move in our industry versus just standing at the bench. We can all have an impact in our own way to ultimately, the patient or the research in some small way. We all play a part in that. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It was an honor to have you here. I look forward to continuing the relationship, and I'll talk to you real soon. Thank you so much, Jason.
Hey, thanks, Kim. Have a great day.
You too.